Hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 13 of Nothing Else Matters, the music podcast that's setting out to try and establish what we think are the 100 greatest albums ever made. To do that, we're getting some help from Rolling Stone magazine by reviewing their latest list of their 100 greatest albums, voting some on or off, and then from there at the end, we'll start to fill the gaps in through our own nominations, through guests, podcast panel, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. So we've got 5 more to review tonight, and to do that, of course, we've got the guys on the panel. So tonight we have Mr. Patterson. George, good evening. How are we doing?
Up yet?
Get up, yeah. John, how are we doing?
Yeah, I'm very well, Brian. Thank you.
Well done for matching your jumper with your poster, as Martin pointed out there. And we have a guest tonight, and we love having the guests on. So tonight we have the artist, writer, singer, musician from the likes of Goodbye Mr. Kenzie and the Filthy Tongues, Martin Metcalfe. Good evening, Martin.
Hello, good to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and hopefully it won't be too painful for you. All righty. So we'll get 5 to review tonight, so let's crack on, and we'll start off with number 40 from the Rolling Stone list. So I'll read you off the Rolling Stone summary, and then we can have a chat about it. So number 40 is David Bowie, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This album documents one of the most elaborate self-mythologizing schemes in rock, as David Bowie created the glittery, messianic alter ego Ziggy Stardust. The glam rock Bowie made with guitarist Mick Ronson is an irresistible blend of sexy, campy pop and blues power, with enduring tracks like Hang On To Yourself and Suffragette City. The anthem Ziggy Stardust was one of rock's earliest and best power ballads. Quote, I consider myself responsible for a whole new school of pretensions, Bowie said. They know who they are, don't you, Elton? Just kidding. No, I'm not. Unquote. So that was David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust. It was released on 16th of June, 1972. And to lead off the chat on that, we're going to have Martin. So, Martin, take us away, mate.
Well, it's, for me, an almost perfect album. I'm really quite hard to please. Even artists that I adore, there'll always be a clunker of a track on an album that I skip mostly. But so, and the clunker on this album is not it's not such a monster, but I did have an issue with Lady Stardust, and I think it's because, funny that you just said that, it's the nearest thing to Elton John on that album.
Right.
You can almost imagine Elton singing it. So I think it's the piano. The album is very, got the folky rock side that I love to Bowie. That was my favorite period, really. The acoustic guitar and the electric guitar together. Everything changed on the following album, really. And there was really a dividing line that when it happened at the end of Ziggy, sort of musically. And I really love that sort of idea of a troubadour from outer space with the guitar slung over the back. I just think it's just such a compelling fantasy that he created there. And this album, I mean, I must have listened to it hundreds and hundreds of times, and multiple hundreds of times, in all sorts of situations. I mean, it goes back to, I was 13 when I first heard it, and I've listened to it in bed sets, I've listened to it in houses of, I've listened to it in here with my my family, and so it's spanned over 4 decades for me, and just an incredible impact, psychologically. And the character of Ziggy kind of became my my father in the sky. It was kind of like a god to me, and I think that's what he went out, he went out his way to create a messiah. And it sounds pretentious, but it was just a perfect conception, I think, because he wasn't capable of being that rock star, and he adopted the character to be able to do it. And just an amazing piece of work, or amazing sort of pinnacle of that period of Bowie. And he also, through that period, really for me, actually was the architect of punk rock as well at the same time. So he was the god of glam at that point, and then he was the architect of punk rock because he produced Lou Reed and referenced the Velvet Underground. He mixed Raw Power by Iggy and the Stooges. He also, any bands in Britain that were near punk were from London were, maybe the Pink Fairies or whatever, but Mott the Hoople probably had a bit of an effect on punk as well. I know they did via Mick Jones from The Clash, who adored Mott the Hoople.
Mm-hmm.
And Bowie produced them, gave them their huge hit. I think he really created the environment in Britain and New York for things to change. I don't think television, basically the punk haircut was Bowie's, lion's mane haircut with the back bit cut off. And it just really rebelled against all the sort of long-haired lazy layabouts that were knocking around rock at that point. And television, I think, took a cue from that. And obviously New York Dolls took a cue from it.
Yeah.
And just brilliant.
And how old would you have been when you sort of fell in love with it?
13 years old. And I think that was significant in that when I heard Starman when I was 10, I kind of didn't like it. His voice didn't sound very pleasant to me. But I think that once you roll over into puberty and the hormones start firing, there's violence on one hand and there's sex on the other, which we'll be talking about later when we get into one of these other albums we're going to review. But the sexual part of it was really important. I think it just became, because he was androgynous and ambiguous and sang about sex, perhaps not on this album. On the following album, there's a song called Lady Grinning Soul, which was just like a dream to me, to live in that room with him and the woman he was singing about. It was just like, so it was like a sexual awakening. And it was just it came at the right time for me, as did punk rock, a year or two later. I missed the Ziggy Mania part of it.
So do you not remember do you remember the Starman performance from the time?
No, right. I don't. I remember Slade. I remember Alice Cooper with the rapier on top of the Pops doing Schools Out, and that was the same year or roughly the same time. But I don't remember Starman, and I don't remember seeing Bowie until I was, got to maybe 1975, something like that.
Okay.
And then it was a world I could occupy straight away, and it was fantastic because he had, a back catalogue of albums that you could immerse yourself in, and live in another world. Because I've got to say that, I'm coming to terms with living and growing up in Bathgate, sort of post-industrial town. It was partially industrial still at the time, but there was a lot of unpleasant sort of, facts that went that came with living in that sort of environment. And I think Bowie provided a perfect sort of fantasy escape.
Yeah,
for a kid of 13.
Perfect. That's brilliant, Martin. Thank you. This was his, I think it was his 5th studio album, and it's the 3rd one that we've reviewed on the list. Hunky Dory and Station to Station, I think, guys, we've reviewed already. So, and I think it's the highest one on the list at the moment. So we'll maybe come back to a couple of those things, but that was really good, mate. Thanks very much. George, what's your take, mate?
I love this album, and it's thematically brilliant, executed to perfection, absurd and assured. I must have listened to it maybe not as many times as Martin has, but a number of times, and I went back to it a couple of times in the last week, just going over it again. It's a phenomenal piece of work. It starts with 4 world-class songs, in my opinion. 5 Years, Soul Love, Moonage Daydream, and Starman. And the second side of the album is just as good, really. He made great albums before Ziggy Stardust, and probably greater ones after Ziggy Stardust. But this is the album, as Martin was saying, this seems to be the album that means most to Bowie fans, the Bowie fans that I know. That you're talking about that Top of the Pops thing, thought I'd call someone, so I picked on you.
Yeah.
I was too young to remember that moment, but I've seen it so many times, and every time I see it, it still gives me the goosebumps. It's phenomenal. Hang On to Yourself basically invents the Buzzcocks. If you think about it, it sounds like a proto Buzzcocks. So yeah, I agree with a lot of what Martin said there.
Is there anything is there any of it that's kind of overrated? Is it one of these ones that has created this kind of mythology around it, or is it just almost a perfect record?
It is almost a perfect record, except for one track, and it's not the one that Martin mentioned. It Ain't Easy for me. Lose that, and this would be in my all-time top 5 albums.
Is that the only cover on the album? I think, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fucking. I don't know who wrote it. It's fucking.
Ron Davis, I think. Yeah,
really,
it's an old kind of 60s cover. Yeah.
Wrote it, but it just sounds a place. You've got those 4 songs, you know, right after Starman, it hits you with It Ain't Easy, and it sounds like something Mott the Hoople would have turned their nose up at. It's really a place. It's a very, very minor criticism, because I think it's a brilliant concept. As a band, he's probably better bands and better musicians playing with him later on, but something about that Bowie, Ronson, Mancy and Boulder combo that seems to work really well. It's a beautiful album, and I think, you know, that there's 4 albums that we're going to review sitting higher up the chart than this is a fucking travesty, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed.
It's Rolling Stone need to have a real good look at themselves.
Well, we've already mentioned that a few times, and they do have the option, of course, to re-rank them all as we get down the line. But for the moment, you're right, it is 40, and it's kind of hard to understand that there might be 39 better ones out there. But I guess we'll get to that. John?
Yeah, I'd probably echo most of what's been said. Funnily, both Martin and George have mentioned what they would maybe perceive to be the weak link in the album. And I was actually having this conversation with my wife earlier, right? And I'm with George. I don't think It Ain't Easy stands up to the rest of the album, right? And Mrs. W's like, well, I think it does. And I'm saying, right, okay, so is there a bad song on it? And she goes, well, I don't think Starman is all that, really. So the divorce papers will be going in the morning, clearly, off the back of that. So
not having
it's
that,
funny.
Marine. Sorry.
Exactly.
Not having that, Marine. No.
It's funny the things you learn about your wife, you know, when you're having a conversation.
More importantly, John, did he write any songs about you? Because I know that they've got a habit of writing songs about you, haven't they? Prince and all the guys. So
that's right. Maybe not in this one.
No.
I can't say I was ever a bisexual alien rock star. But,
even though you dress like one.
Even though I dress like one, maybe one day, who knows? But yeah, I mean, you talk about that Top of the Pops performance and stuff like that, and I think this is probably the album that really landed big time for him. You know, obviously like so Hunky Dory before, and you know he's well known, but this is the one where I think he's just taken off into the stratosphere. And that lineup, you know, you look at them, and they really do look like rock stars, don't they? You know, you're not going to see those guys walking down Falkirk High Street on a wet Tuesday night, quite frankly. So I just love it. I think it's a great album. There's often this talk about, you know, is it a concept album, all that sort of stuff. And I think some of those albums can be quite difficult to get into. You know, I think we've talked previously about the likes of The Who in that area, but this is just blows you away, really. You know, I think lyrically very, very good. And obviously the cover and back cover are quite iconic as well. And I know we've talked, I won't do it tonight, but the Royal Mail Classic album covers, this is one of those ones. So I've got that over there.
You got it at your hand.
Come on, John. You've always got it, John. Come on, show us it.
Maybe in a minute. But interestingly, Starman, he was asked to write that, you know, quite late on, I think, in the process, because the record company have gone, well, where's the single? So he's then went away and wrote Starman, and funnily enough, that did replace a cover. So he'd done a cover of Chuck Berry, Round and Round, which was supposed to be an album.
Yeah.
But Starman took its place. maybe Marion would prefer a Chuck Berry cover. You know, who knows?
No.
Personally, I don't. I'm going with Starman.
Yeah, me too, mate. Twitter were big fans. I think I think it's the highest vote we've ever had for Twitter. 95% of the guys that stuck a poll in were big fans of this one, which I suppose it doesn't get. 5% of the idiots, George, of course. Spot on.
There we go.
There we are. I thought you were going to hold up your two albums that you have. No,
Nice almighty, you didn't. You mentioned this.
Yeah, I know. That's okay. We'll give you that.
Yeah.
So 95% Twitter, yes. 38 minutes long, absolute sweet spot. I think it was his, as you say, it was his kick-off album, 11 #1 albums after all that kind of stuff. There's not an awful lot more to add, I think, for him, because it is iconic. You know, you talk about some albums being iconic. I think this one is iconic, and then of course the artist becomes even more iconic for doing that. The only other comment I had before we maybe have a wee vote on it was two things I smiled at. One was that they launched the Ziggy Stardust from Mars thing. They launched them in the Toby Jug pub in Tamworth, which I always smile at, you know, that kind of above a pub room thing that we all used to kind of go to gigs at, and that was where they did the first performance, which I think is kind of quite nice. And the other thing was that when he went to Bromley Tech, I didn't realise that the head of the school was Peter Frampton's dad.
I know Bowie and Frampton were good mates. Correct.
They then ended up hooking back up somewhere down the line on that, which I think was quite unusual. But it's an amazing album. I love it. I think we're all Bowie fans, so.
Can I add one shocking fact?
Go on, we love a fact. Go on then.
Because I looked closely at this album, how it was recorded. It was recorded in 12 days and mixed in 12 days. That includes strings and everything. Apart from it ain't easy, because funny you said it doesn't sound like it belongs in the album. It was recorded during the Hunky Dory sessions for that album. But and John just said that the label said, "Where's your single?" And he did write it very, you know, because they had a break. They had a Christmas break between starting the recording and finishing it. And he wrote Starman, Suffragette City, and Rock and Roll Suicide over the Christmas break.
Wow.
It's incredible.
Tasty.
Everybody else is watching the two Ronnies and Morecambe and Wise, and Bowie's coming up with this.
I know. Amazing. You're right, Martin. If for nothing else, that just gives the guy his status, doesn't it? It's absolutely fantastic. Okay, we'll have a wee vote on it, because I think we're feeling the love here. So I got comments in from some of the guys that have been on before, but as you can imagine, they were all very positive. David Ross says that he could vote it in twice if he could. It's that kind of that positive, really. So it feels as if we've got a bit of a full house here. So Martin, you're in for sure.
You're in, yeah. George,
100%.
Mr. Welsh,
yes.
Fantastic, brilliant. We're all in there. The one thing that kind of I've always loved about him since I kind of got to know him, but the one thing that made me love him more was when he did Live Aid. So I know we're jumping forward a number of years there, but of course he dropped 5 years, didn't he, from the set to show that. You remember the video about the African children that were dying and stuff, right? So that was his time slot, and he offered to drop 5 years so that they could show the video. And you know, if you think about some of the other artists that used it as a kind of stage almost to kind of start their career and stuff, he was the absolute opposite of that. And I'm so enamored by the guy. He's absolutely genius.
Yeah, I wish he dropped Modern Love instead of that.
I know a man on this podcast who loves Let's Dance.
I'll fight any man who doesn't love it. It's a great album.
So just to square it off then before we finish on Bowie. So at the moment, we've got, I think we've voted all three on that's on the list at the moment. But as I say, at the moment, we don't have any others. Maybe one for Martin because we'll get the chance to chat it. But if there was another album, Martin, that you would put on the list that was a Bowie record, is there one you would fall on yourself for?
But I know that Station's on there, and I know that Hunky Dory's on there.
Yeah.
So I would definitely put Diamond Dogs on, because half of that is total genius.
Right. Okay. I know Graham Skinner's a huge Diamond Dogs fan as well. It's quite interesting. It's one of these ones, I think we say this before, we kind of change our mind on the Bowie records every every month, I guess, which ones we love the most. But George, you got a favourite on that before we move on from Bowie?
Probably Young Americans, actually.
Young Americans. John?
Well, I'll just throw one in here because I think it's a genius piece of work. Black Star.
Yeah.
Wow.
Good shout.
Yeah, that's a great shout. And to finish with that like he did is, yeah, we're tipping our hat again, aren't we? So Bowie's in, 100%, and well deserved. Number 39 on the list is Talking Heads, Remaining Light. Okay, so from Rolling Stone, David Burns said Remaining Light, quote, was done in bits and pieces, one instrument at a time. The result was a new wave masterpiece powered by Burns' revelation, as he put it on the Great Curve, that the world moves on a woman's hips. The combined thrust of a P-Funk dance party, the ancient to the future rhythm hypnosis of Nigeria funk master Fela Kuti, and the studied adventures of the album's producer and Heads co-conspirator Brian Eno. Remaining Light marked Talking Heads' transformation from avatars of the punk avant-garde to polyrhythmic magicians with hit single appeal. Just try not dancing to Once in a Lifetime. So that was Remaining Light, released on the 8th of October 1980. John, take us away, mate.
Okay, so I mean, I do have a few Talking Heads albums, but I do recall at the time I wasn't exactly a huge fan of this at the time. I much preferred Fear of Music, which was the album that preceded it. So I've not listened to it in years, and I've listened to it, over the past few days. I'm probably pleasantly surprised by how I, feel about it now. Definitely warrant it a bit more than maybe what I did 25, 30 years ago. At the time, I think it's quite interesting as well. This was a fourth album in 4 years, so it's quite a lot of output in a reasonably short period of time, and you can see they've moved on from where they started off. They started playing at CBGBs, and they quickly moved into this kind of art, funky post-punk new wave band. But there's clearly a bit of band animosity going on throughout the time. And I read Chris Fran's autobiography last year, which was quite frankly, a bit shit for autobiographies, I felt. But it did come across in some of the, let's say, barbs about David Byrne. And I think, him in particular and his wife, Tina Weymouth, felt quite pushed out in the creative process of making this album. So it does interest me about that creative tension, getting to great music versus the group aesthetic where you might not be agreeing, but you get to a point where, you produce a body of work. And those tensions in the band just, I think, festered as time went by. And I don't think, reading between the lines, it doesn't look like David Byrne was an especially easy guy to go on with. Brian Eno's influence is in there quite a bit, I think, in terms of how you read about how they put the album together. It's really quite interesting. He talks about, he did a paper, the studio as a compositional tool, which talks about, historically, you would just go in and record, a band would record potentially almost as if they were playing live, pull it together. But he was actually looking at that and using the studio to manipulate the material, which wasn't new. It had been done before. Yeah. But this is probably a really good example of that, as an album. Probably quite a lot of kind of world African / influences going on there. Quite a bit of funk, some really great guitar as well, and likes of the Great Curve, I thought, especially. Listening Wind as well, which I thought that was actually a song that was re-recorded by the Specials 3 or 4 years ago when they did their Protest Songs album. Yep. Which is about, depending on your point of view, an African terrorist / freedom fighter seeing their own country being overtaken by an imperial Western power and what they feel about it. So that wasn't something I'd necessarily associated with Talking Heads coming up with lyrically. So I do recall when that Specials album came out, I went and listened to that track specifically. But I like it. I think, and the last song, especially the Overload, I think that's really dark and quite atmospheric. Again, really quite different to what you would normally associate with them, and I really like that song. So, it's quite unusual for the Talking Heads, I felt. It's not
kind
the
of
type
Joy
of music.
Division feel to it.
Yeah, maybe. It's quite dark and atmospheric. So
yeah.
So I found it quite an interesting album. Would it be my favourite Talking Heads album now? No, it wouldn't be. But I think, as a reappraisal, I think I appreciate it a lot more than what I would have done in my teenage years.
Cool, fantastic, Martin.
Well, our band loved this album to bits. Myself and Derek Kelly really enjoyed the Talking Heads. There was a documentary made just before this album came out, and it was how David Byrne was looking at evangelist preachers in America and taking a lot of cues from their what he pointed out was a performance, and how they lived on or died on the performance. In fact, that was how they paid the rent. You know what I mean? So it was, he saw them as kind of, having a rock star element to them, and he used a lot. And Once in a Lifetime, if you listen to it, it's basically sampled, although he's singing it or speaking it, things that preachers say from the pulpit in the States at the time. Anyway, you may say to yourself, how did I get here? It's just a discourse from a preacher. And it was also pointed out not too long ago that Elvis Presley actually took the place of the preacher. That's singers before were just stood at a microphone and sang a song. It wasn't like, Frank Sinatra danced in movies or what have you, but when he was singing originally, he just sang. Mm-hmm. Whereas Elvis kind of took the stage in the same way that Southern Baptist preachers would. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting ideas in this album, and it's I think it's a brilliant listen. I listened to it again, and almost again, I think it's a perfect album. In fact, it's probably 99.9% perfect for what it is in its own terms.
What's the point one, Martin?
The point one's just that Once in a Lifetime's been hit too much.
So a bit of fatigue, really.
Fed up of it. Yeah. But Adrian Belew's guitar work, astonishing guitar work on this album. Mm-hmm. Amazing sort of choral vocals, obviously dreamt up by David Byrne and Brian Eno. I think his voice, Brian Eno's voice is in there as well. I think it's an amazing record. And it's funny you mentioned the Overload, because apparently David Byrne had heard about this band called Joy Division in the UK.
Right.
And rather than going and listening to them to research them, he decided to get someone who'd heard them to describe what they were like. And then he went away and wrote a song, which was this song.
Wow.
Based on what he'd heard.
Wow. Based on what the description.
Yeah. Without actually hearing the music.
Yeah. And it is quite close to Joy Division, and David Byrne says, actually, I think it's better.
Of course he did, yeah. A couple of things, on top of that, talk about the sound of it. I know there was quite a lot of hip-hop, or early hip-hop, as he quoted it, from New York and stuff. So we've had a few albums that are kind of got that hip-hop thing to it that we talk about. So there's a bit of that in there that I hadn't really heard before when I was a bit younger. Also, I didn't quite work out that there's no loops or anything on the record. It's all played, isn't it? Although they just kind of repeat play. And I was amazed. I don't know what that means, to be honest, but I just assumed some of it was on a trip in it, and it's not, which I think is amazing. And Adrian Belew, I think all his guitar parts were recorded in one day for the album. Yeah, so he was a gun for hire, wasn't it? And he came in and just absolutely smashed it and went away again. So
look him up, and there's a song he did with King Crimson. Adrian Belew joined King Crimson when they became a post-punk band, which was news to me. And if you go and look that on YouTube, you can see him playing this. The way it sounds on this album.
Yeah,
he can make that happen live. It's just incredible.
So he was in vogue at the time. He was a Bowie man, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. A bit like Robert Fripp, the guy's absolutely brilliant.
I
Okay.
think he also toured it
sorry,
last
John.
year with Jerry. He had toured it last year in the States with Jerry Harrison.
He did, yeah. Saw they were doing that again, which is quite interesting.
Wouldn't mind seeing that myself.
Not at all, mate. George, come in there. What are you thinking?
I didn't know the album very well. I'd heard it back in the 80s, and I probably heard it around about the time when Paul Simon's Gracelands was coming out, and I had a real sort of phobia to this sort of white man's African
appropriation
stuff. It didn't ring true with me, but listening back to it, it was absolutely Afro-tastic. For want of a better phrase, I'm struggling to think of a better white rhythm section than Tina Weymouth and Chris France. I think they're absolutely perfect. And I love the Tom Tom Club, which obviously came the year after it. So that seemed to be an extension of what they were doing here with Remaining Light. I think it's timeless. It sounds as if it could have been recorded last week. It's the third of the Eno collaborations they had. But I think this could be their best record. Because I went down a wee rabbit hole there with Talking Heads when I was listening to this. I thought I'd listen to the other albums again and revisit some of their old stuff. And I enjoyed this one probably more than I was expecting to. What Martin was saying about the preacher kind of conceit there that David Byrne was coming out with. If you remember the video for Once in a Lifetime, he was dressed like sort of almost like Buddy Holly, but he had this sort of tight-fitting dark suits and this, which was basically the soul man's kind of uniform. And I always thought that Byrne resembled vocally Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops. Now, he doesn't sound like Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops, but his delivery, the timbre, and how he projects the idea come across quite similar to things like Reach Out, I'll Be There, by the Four Tops. So listening back to Once in a Lifetime again, which I hadn't heard outside of radio plays for a long time, just get really into it. I'm not fatigued with that song at all. That is a fucking killer song. That is a song any band would give their right arm for. It's brilliant. The album's got some great contributions for people like Adrian Belew, as you mentioned. I didn't realise that Robert Palmer played percussion on the album, and Nona Hendrix was one of the female vocals on.
Didn't know that.
Nona Hendrix a La Belle. So there was a real soul vibe to that, white soul kind of vibe. But I think it's fantastic. It's a great album, and I would say it's got to be up there with any of their albums.
I think there's one more on the 500 list, but not on the 100. More songs about building and food was, I think, 360 or something like that. So this is the only one we're getting at the moment. It was album of the year at the time. I think the Sounds had it as album of the year. I think it was top 5 NME. Village Voice, it was top 3, and I think 2 was London Calling. The Clash, because that came out later in America than here, and 1 was The River by Springsteen. So it was, fairly sort of meaty list to get on. So they've had the recognition, and I suppose looking back on it, they were sort of ahead of their time maybe in many ways.
But I loved what they did next. I loved the Tom Tom Club. I've actually got it here.
I saw you were tweeting about that the other day, I think, weren't you? Yeah, saw that.
It's a cracking album. It's
have you got 2 copies, George? Do you listen to it in stereo or just one minute? Right,
only John does that.
Of course, Stop Making Sense. The video was done by Tony Basil.
Once in a Lifetime.
Once in a Lifetime, sorry. Yeah, no, Stop Making Sense. So because she was a big choreographer, wasn't she, before she had had hits and stuff, which I thought was interesting as well. So 4 studio album, only 1 on the list. They kind of sold more later on with Little Creatures and stuff like that, but this feel as if it was kind of, I guess, quite an important one. The only thing I called out was that the very first gig that they done was supporting the Ramones in '76, I think, New York. So that's kind of a nice way to start, I think, isn't it? If you're going to get good on it. I saw them, actually. Remember seeing them on Old Grey Whistle Test in real time, which was about 78, I think, doing Psycho Killer. I had no idea who they were. You know, literally no idea. I just thought they were a bit like David Bowie. I thought they sort of landed from somewhere. They were so different. And I bought Talking Heads. I bought Talking Heads 77. And I then never bought another Talking Heads album until Stop Making Sense came out. And then I had to go back and revisit them again and stuff. So, but yeah, I'm a big fan of it. Really good. Okay, we'll have a wee vote on that. Any other tidbits for us? John, you're always good at giving us one or two more.
I think, George was saying about Robert Palmer there and Nona Hendricks. That came about because of where they were recording the album, and Robert Palmer just happened to be there at the time, recording as well. And it's like, well, do you want to come in and do some stuff? Yeah. And that's what led to that,
Yeah,
so,
you can't argue with that. I like the
and they then returned as the Tom Tom Club to record at Compass Point again. They love it. They liked it so much they bought a place there.
Yeah, that's right, and they kept recording there, didn't they? Yeah, going forward. I like bringing it forward to real time before we have a vote on it. Did you see the video trailer recently for the Stop Making Sense reissue? Where he goes back to the dry cleaners and gets the suit out and stuff.
Picks his suit up again,
I mean, that's clever, isn't it?
Yeah, very good.
Very clever. Okay, cool. Not much to add to that. Great album. It sounds amazing. Still sounds very, very fresh. Big influence on Kid A. From Radiohead, which Johnny Green was the guy.
I think it must have been a big influence on Orange Juice as well. When I was listening back to it, I just had real, when the Rip It Up album from Orange Juice had real that sort of Afrobeat vibes, obviously with Zeke on drums. So I think not only Radiohead but Orange Juice as well.
And was Jerry Harrison? Was he not in the Modern Lovers?
Yeah,
at some point, I think, wasn't it? So
yeah, was I.
We're covering off your whole poster here, John. If we can get something to do with James King, we're sorted, right? We'll get back to that. Okay, so who went off there? John, what are you saying then? So you started us off
there. So I would vote it in. I think it's a really solid album. Still not convinced it's my favourite one, but I think it deserves a place in the top 100.
Okay, Martin?
Definitely. Yeah, 100%.
Brilliant. George?
Yeah, I think it's timeless and it sounds still very, very fresh. Possibly my favourite Talking Heads album.
Okay. Well, we don't get another one at the moment. I'm a yes as well. And again, if we're doing live albums, I would certainly put Stop Making Sense in, but we're not. So I'm not. 81% Twitter again. Big upside on that one. So thanks, guys, for that. And 40 minutes again. So absolute sweet spot on sort of length for us, so struggling to pick holes in it. There is a version of Once in a Lifetime done on the Muppet Show by Kermit and all the guys. If you ever get 5 minutes to spare, it's on YouTube.
You may find yourself.
It's everything you'd expect it to be. So Talking Heads are in. It's cracking. Okay, so keeping the big ones coming. 38 is Bob Dylan, Blonde on Blonde. Okay, so rock's first studio double LP by a major artist was, as Bob Dylan declared in 1978, quote, "the closest I ever got to the sound I hear in my head, that thin, that wild Mercury sound." Blonde on Blonde was mainly recorded in Nashville with the session pros, who created an almost contradictory magnificence, a tightly wound tension around Dylan's quicksilver language and decisive singing and barrelhouse realism such as Rainy Day Woman and Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again. Amid the frenzy, Dylan delivered some of his finest, clearest songs of comfort and desire. The Sidelong Beauty, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, and I Want You, the title of which Dylan almost used for the album. So that was Blonde on Blonde, released 20th of June 1966, and just before I bring George in, which was sandwiched between the release of Pet Sounds in May and Revolver in August, which I thought was quite interesting as a bit of a sort of timestamp on it. So what we got? George, tell us about Blonde on Blonde, mate.
I've not listened to the album for some time, actually, so it was good to go back and revisit it again.
Are you a Dylan fan?
I'm a Dylan fan. I wouldn't say I'm a Dylan diehard, but
No.
when I get deep into Dylan, then I can really appreciate him. You know, things like Desire and Blood in the Tracks. They're the two that I would go back to probably more often than not. This one, he recorded 3 albums, and this was the third of the 3, quite similar in theme and style. It starts off a wee bit as an extension of Highway 61 with that Rainy Day Women sort of drunken rag taking you down a blind alley, so to speak. But once you heard that, the pedestrian, it's a sort of pedestrian pledging my time. Yeah, you maybe get worried that it's going to go a bit like a variant of the previous ones, but it really kicks off with the last 2 songs on side 1 for me, The Masterful Visions of Joanna and One of Us Must Know. They're absolutely brilliant songs. So that's moved Dylan up another level. And side 2 kicks off with I Want You, which is classic playful pop, and then the 9-verse epic Stuck Inside a Mobile. And the side 2 ends with Just Like a Woman, which is one of my favourite Dylan songs. Side 3 starts and busts out the traps the same kind of way as side 2 did, but side 4 is probably what tips the album from good to great for me. Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands is one of Dylan's, I'd say it's in his top 5 songs of all time. It's about 12 minutes long or something. That's a fantastic song. And
that's the only track in side 4, isn't it?
The only track in side 4, and he's brave enough to really go for it and put a whole song, take his time with the song, which is, you know, in rock, doing a double album is one thing, but going, you know, unless you were, you know, at that time, prog didn't really exist, but really going balls out and sticking this, you know, 12-minute love song to your wife, you know, very plaintive and beautiful. And, you know, I got a quote for Tom Waits. It says, "It's like Beowulf, it takes me out to the meadow. The song can make you leave home, work on a railroad, or marry a gypsy. I think of a drifter around a fire with a tin cup under a bridge, remembering a woman's hair. The song is a dream, a riddle, and a prayer." That's pretty much... I can't top what Tom Waits says at the best of times, but that it just nails it there for me. I think after this, Dylan took himself away. He's playing with the band a lot in this. Guys like Al Cooper and you know, once he moved away from those guys and reinvented himself, he reinvented himself at a slower pace than guys like Bowie did. But once he did and get into the early 70s and his marriage started failing and did Planet Waves and then Blood in the Tracks, that's where Dylan absolutely nailed what he did. So the early 60s stuff, mid-60s stuff is great, but see, when you get into mid-70s, that's absolute prime Dylan for me. Having said that, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands is a real nod to where he's heading next. And as such, that probably knocks it into great rather than good album.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll maybe touch on his post output in a second. So this was his 7th studio album. He's actually got 3 albums on the list at the moment, but this is the first one that we've reviewed. It's got a couple that are higher than this, which we'll come back to. Martin?
I like this album. It's a good album, but I'm of a different view about where it stands. Luckily for me, I think the other 2 albums are in the top 100. So, you know, I love Highway 61 Revisited, and is it Bringing It All Back Home?
Bring It All Back Home.
I love both those albums. There's tracks on that are, to me, have come from another world. It's All Right, Ma is just, you know, it's astonishing to me, the lyrical sort of the power of the lyrics and that song. So I hear echoes of that in this album, but the way I feel about this album is it's more about, it feels more like he's created a template with the previous two albums, and now he's got this new band to play with, and he's, to me, a lot of the album is just having fun with the new band. It just feels like it's kind of like, it echoes London Calling to me, which was, for me, coming out of the punk, explosion, it was, I was confused about my ambivalence about it. It just felt like too light or something, for me. And Blonde on Blonde has an element of that for me. Although it's a really great album, and I would, it's the perfect Sunday afternoon music for, and I don't think I would ever say to anyone, I've had enough of that. I could have it going on, maybe not focus on it, but have it going on, and I could live with this album really harmoniously.
So this was his third album that he recorded in just over 15 months. So the other two that you've touched on there, and this was the third one of that, and this is the only double, I think. You talked about it being the first sort of rock album, double album thing. So do you think, is it about the sort of sheer weight of, what is it, 73 minutes long, which is so unusual, certainly for that time when even the Beatles were knocking out albums in 35 minutes or so? Is it some of that? Is there a bit of padding in it maybe? Or
I don't really think so. I just don't think it has the edge of, I'm going to reference, I have trouble with Dylan's titles because he doesn't call his songs after the chorus, you know what I mean? So obviously
like books. They do sound like books.
They do. The length of it.
One easy one's Desolation Row. I think there isn't a song on this album that beats Desolation Row, and there's not a song that, for me, betters It's All Right Ma, or actually for Exuberance and Total Madness is Bob Dylan's 115th Dream. That song made me laugh out loud when I went on that journey with him through this dream, and when he's declaring to the bouncer or whoever won't let him in the place he wants to get in, he said they did that to Jesus too, and the bouncer says, "You ain't him," and just the language, it just made me laugh out loud. And there's so much, and Captain Arab instead of Ahab.
Yeah,
and I do believe actually he probably was waking up and writing lyrics out of dreams, that he was actually doing that. So this album's good, but I just don't think it's, I think that the cutting edge lyrically was the previous two albums, and he's cruising with that inventiveness on this album, and he's kind of using that language, but it's not cutting edge anymore. It's just what he does now, and he's just having fun, and it's a good album. That's all.
Retrospectively, there's talk, of course, that he was already heading for his kind of breakdown, for want of a better word, because he'd been having all this touring, and he'd made the documentary, and he'd had all the electric stuff kicking off and all the other things that you talk about. Because, of course, after this, actually, when the album just came out, he had his bike accident, inverted commas, and he went off the grid for what, thick end of a year, I think. He went off the grid and did the Basement Tapes and all those other things that he did. So there feels as if there does feel, for me, there feels like a kind of tiredness to the album, which doesn't make the songs bad. I love the album, but it does sound as if he's running on empty a little bit, and you can see why he went to Nashville and to sort of reinvigorate something different, I guess. But as George says, he took Robbie Robertson, and so he still had that link back to New York and the band and all those other things, and it's that kind of fusion of the two that's really interesting.
It's the last song on the album that makes me think that he really wants to move into the more personal rather than the allegorical,
Yeah.
And that's what makes it special for me. It's like a wee glimpse into what's coming a few years later.
I think he's good. He's really good with on this album with the personal stuff.
Yeah.
When he goes on about, I can't remember, there was one about somebody wearing, Jesus wearing Jester's shoes or something like that, an image like that comes in. And I just thought, this is coming from Desolation Row, and It's All Right Ma, which was hugely creative lyrically, but he's just not feeling the genius of that.
Yeah, absolutely. John?
He's running out of metaphors.
John?
Yeah, so probably about 10 years ago, I hadn't listened to very much, if any, Dylan, full stop. And I was thinking, I need to sort that out. But where do you start, given the size of back catalogue that he's got? So I did ask a few people, and the general consensus was go and look at that trilogy of albums, get into that, listen to those, right? And that's exactly what I did. Bringing it all back home, Highway 61 revisited in this one. And funnily enough, my view hasn't changed from then to now, that I think this is out those three albums. This is the one I don't think stands up as well as the other two. You know, so I think if I was asked for a favourite out of those ones, this would be the one that I'd pick last. I just find my mind was wandering quite often. You know, every time I was listening to it, I'd go a couple of songs, and go, shit, what happened there? You know, and I just ended up thinking about other stuff, and so it didn't keep my attention in a way that, you know, I guess a truly great album should do for me personally.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, and perhaps, you know, you talk about padding, etc., but I think if this is a single album, you pick, you know, the best tracks from it, it would absolutely, you know, be ticking, you know, a lot more boxes for me than it is at the moment. So a lot of great album tracks in there, a couple of singles, which I think are fantastic. But looking at those three albums, I think it's okay. It's a good album, and I don't think it's a great album.
So we get Highway 61, that's coming on further up the list, but we don't get Bring It All Back Home at the moment, just to give that a bit of context to the list. So are you saying that if you were going to vote for 2 out of the 3, this would be third of the 3? Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it would be.
All right, cool. Fine, well, we'll get back to that. I think a couple of things just to comment on there. He'd had that sort of checker pass thing, so he'd already walked out on the Ed Sullivan show, which I always like guys that they kind of stand by what they stand for, because they asked him to mime and stuff like that, and he wouldn't do it. I read a really nice quote about, is it Fourth Time Around, one of the tracks on it, which the guy says, so if you remember, Dylan and the Beatles had this sort of famous hotel cannabis smoking pot session thing in New York, 64 time. And although that was kind of incidental as an incident, what came from it was that the Beatles moved into kind of folk, if you want, through Rubber Soul, wrote Norwegian Wood. And the guy said that Fourth Time Around is Dylan impersonating Lennon, impersonating Dylan, which I thought was quite clever, because of course Dylan moved into a bit more rock and stuff, didn't he, after that, because he really liked the way the Beatles did that kind of, you know, edgy, sharp, kind of clean stuff. So kind of quite interesting. Another thing, another review that I heard was really nice was that the guy liked it. He didn't love it, he says, but what I like about it is, he says, it's a bit of a journey. And he said that the album begins with a joke, but it ends with a hymn. And you know, he was kind of saying you can almost feel the guy kind of changing as he goes through the album, which when you reflect on that, I think it's probably a bit in that. And as George says, he probably didn't go back to that kind of original protest third sort of person stuff. So, which is fascinating. He then did the bootleg series, which retrospectively some of the best songs I've ever heard are on some of those bootleg albums with the band and what have you. So got a lot of time for him. Okay, guys, we're all thumbs up on Dylan. David said it was a masterpiece, so there's nobody else who's voted so far has voted it out. So we've got some decisions to make on this one. George, you led us off here, mate. What are you saying?
Yeah, because this seems to be the bridge that he crossed at this point in his career and his life. And Sad Eye Lady of the Lowlands was, you know, basically the roadmap for what came next. I have to put it in.
Okay, cool. Martin?
I would put it in as well, because if it was David Bowie, and to make a comparison, and say he had Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, and Hunky Dory there. You know, probably Aladdin Sane would be the most iffy one for me, but I would have to say it's so significant that you know, you would have to put it in, and I think so. Going with that logic, I would put Blonde on Blonde in as well.
Okay, thank you, John.
I'm going to say no.
Okay, no bother.
Just don't think it stands up.
Your reasons were fair enough, mate. I would put it in, but I think you're probably right. I think I would probably listen to those other two, or maybe Blood in the Tracks and stuff. I actually prefer other stuff. I'm a bit weird and dull, and I like his Pat Garrett soundtrack and stuff like that. I like it when he kind of goes off the edges a little bit and doesn't seem to care so much. But I do think it's a great album. I also like what it done to records after that. I think it definitely changed the shape of albums, and they became like a piece of work and stuff, which I think, you know, that's the kind of thing I like. So it does, it carries. I'm sorry, John, mate, you're much as we love your input. So what do we call him? He was called Minnesota's answer to Mary Hildes Donovan, which I quite liked. And George, you knocked out The Truth from Duluth. Was that yours?
It was me, yeah.
It was, yeah. Well done, mate. Twitter's good for some stuff, isn't it? So, 77% were in. Another other thing I'd say, just if you're ever passing time, so, because he was, at the time, he was going through a lot of stuff, and he stopped touring after this. He didn't tour for 8 years after 66. But one of the last gigs he did was that Royal Albert Hall gig, which is sort of fairly famous, where he did a sort of an acoustic set and then he did a live set. I don't know if there is a bootleg of it. I've never heard it, but there is a version of it on YouTube you can listen to, which is just an audio only full concert, and it's fascinating, just as a sort of moment in time piece. It's actually very, very interesting to listen to. So he is in, which is cool. So we're 3 down so far, got 2 to go. Number 37 is Dr. Dre, The Chronic. Okay, so when George Clinton first heard hip-hop artists blending old records with new beats, he wasn't too impressed. But then Dr. Dre turned samples of Clinton's P-Funk sides into G-Funk, and Dr. Funkenstein approved, calling funk, quote, the DNA of hip-hop and rap. Dre had already taken gangster rap to the mainstream with his earlier group, NWA, but on The Chronic, he funked up the rhymes with a smooth, bass-heavy production style and the laid-back delivery of then-unknown rapper Snoop Doggy Dogg. When Dre and Snoop dropped Nothing But a G-Thang, there was no getting out of the way. So that's the Rolling Stone summary. It was released on the 5th of December, 92, and it was his debut studio album as a solo artist. John, Dr. Dre.
Yeah, I was quite disappointed with this album, quite frankly. I thought it was going to be a lot better than my view on it. I know a lot of mates that I absolutely swear by this album, probably because there's quite a lot of swearing on it. They love it. And, you know, I think if we look back to one of the previous podcasts that we had, we talked about NWA, Straight Outta Compton, which I was quite a strong advocate for. I thought it was a great album.
Yeah, we voted it in, I think, didn't we?
Did we?
Yeah, we did. Sure. Yeah, we did.
Did we?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I really liked that, and then he's come up with this, and I just every single track, you know, and I'm probably sounding like, you know, mold uncle, you know, so every single track's got a spare. No, I can't believe I'm saying this, but there's a point when it gets almost like okay, I get it, but it's almost gone too far, you know, and it's 100% gangster rap. It's drugs, guns, sex, the N-word, the bitches, the hoes, all this kind of thing, right? And it's just too much. Underneath it, there is some really good songs in there. You know, I'm not saying, you know, there wouldn't be aspects of it I wouldn't listen to again. I think, like a Little Ghetto Boy, it's got a flute in it, which I thought was just really different. It's quite light, summer light tune. Snoop Dogg's on it. Coincidentally, Snoop Dogg wasn't really known at this period of time, and you know that led to him then coming out with his Doggy Style album, which I think came out a year or two later. And I actually remember when that came out because I bought it, and I loved that album at the time.
So do you not like Snoop's rapping on this, or?
No, I do. I
You
do,
do like it,
but
right? Okay.
I do like it in bits, but I just find it's just tiresome in terms of the repetition of the message and what he's singing about. And I do get, can be talking about singing about their experiences and all that kind of stuff. But I'm kind of thinking by this point, you've got to move on and develop your sound a little bit. But it was just too much of the one thing for me. This kind of death row records and, this East Coast, West Coast rivalry and all that kind of stuff. It was just over the top. But I think within it, there are, some reasonably decent tunes. Was it innovative? Probably to a point. Some cracking samples. I think you mentioned George Clinton, Parliament, Funkadelic, even a little bit of Led Zeppelin, I believe, is in there as well. So,
yep.
I just, as I say, I just found it all too much, over the top. I don't think it's nuanced enough for me to, give this a listen again in my life. It'll not be happening.
Okay. Okay, well, we're going to keep talking about it for 5-10 minutes if you can bear with us. So he'd done a few albums with NWA. We did vote NWA, and I think we're all fans of it. And he then had a bit of the kind of fallout with a couple of other guys in the group, and he's did the solo album. But he actually only done, I think he did 3 solo albums, I think, in his whole career. So he's not been prolific since this came out. It was almost, I guess, a bit of a statement that I can do this on my own, and then he's went on and done a lot of the influencing through producing and some of the other artists that he's discovered, Eminem and a few others. So he's got an interesting character. He also wasn't really part of that East-West Coast thing, albeit he was from the West Coast, but he did work with Jay-Z and various other guys. So you're right, Jordan, there is a theme to it, but I think he was kind of individual in his own way. I think he sort of ploughed his own furrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've mentioned it a couple of times in some of the rap albums, and that they're like a feud. And the right songs,
like
say
dissing,
the right
don't
songs
they?
about
Like
Easy E. I do, aye, yeah, and it's like,
I know George likes it,
is that
dissing
all
on
you've
it.
got to, is that all you've got to sing about? It's just so predictable.
Yeah.
So
I get that.
aye, okay.
I do get
Right,
that. Absolutely, totally get that. Martin.
I think this album is, and I don't really mean to be flippant about it, but it sounds like the results of PTSD. So it's like living in that environment. It's like putting 2, abused dogs in a cage and seeing what happens, kind of thing. They've grown up in this fairly horrific environment where, of oppression, police oppression in particular, and it's obviously horrible. And I can't really imagine what it's like growing up like that. I mentioned Bathgate earlier on, and it's nothing like what they had to deal with. When I was 14, I really needed to hear the Sex Pistols. I really needed to hear the Sex Pistols. It changed my life when I heard the Sex Pistols. We're talking about confrontational music and a bit of dissing and some bad language and all of that. It made me feel like I belonged somewhere in the world. And so therefore, as a therapeutic tool for young Black kids aged 14, 15 or whatever, this sort of music will fill them up with a feeling of power, I would think, and so I can't say that I would dismiss it completely, but I'm totally with John. It gets really tiring listening to, actually, you wouldn't be. It sounds like listening to Andrew Tate to me. This album. This is a total Andrew Tate attitude album.
Okay.
It's really what you would call now toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
And although there was elements of that in the punk
You
movement.
think that's what he was trying to do? Yeah, or is it not just looking, it's one of these ones that you're looking back on? I think, was he not just talking about where he was and where sort of society was? And
well, their society,
yeah,
the law of the jungle, eat or be eaten and dominate and all of that stuff. And they say it in the album, this is how I survive. I've got to do this to survive. And the songs that actually the songs I like are probably the songs that kind of give me a bit of cognitive dissonance. There's a song called Rat-a-tat-tat, and which I think is a really good song. And there's another one called Nigger with a Gun, Who's the man with the master plan? The nigger with a motherfucking gun. And I can really feel the power of that, I have power. And they talk about their guns all the time. Gats, Glocks, AKs. They're women. It's very materialistic. It's materialistic. It's misogynistic. It's violent. But I'm not... I can handle a bit of that, I can deal with a bit of that. I really think that this album could completely be transplanted, swapped for an album called Black Sunday by Cypress Hill, which came out about the same time. And I would have loved to have listened to that album,
Okay.
But this was a trial to listen to. It really was hard work.
Okay. Yeah. So this is one, they've done the Rolling Stone list a few times. So I think when the first list was done, this was on the list at 138. But then 15 years down the line, it's now moved up to 37. And there's quite a few of these albums that appear to be getting more recognition as kind of time goes on. So, whether it was or wasn't of its time, it doesn't appear to be kind of dating in the industry, if that's the best way of putting it, which is the guys that voted for this, which is quite interesting. We've always found it quite difficult to put ourselves in those shoes and, see the world, I guess, how they saw it at the time. George?
Yeah, again, we go back to the same topics that we've mentioned on a number of occasions here about being a bunch of middle-aged white guys talking about a world that we don't recognise. That said, as Martin pointed out, there was elements of the nascent hip-hop movement that were very much like punk for those young kids that were living in oppression in the West Coast of the United States at the time, and in New York City and any other urban build-up. For me, listening to it, I'd never listened to it at the time. I was aware of it, but I'd never really listened to it at the time because it wasn't really my thing. But nothing but a G thing would be played, the radio edited and dropped and dubbed and whatever, you were aware of these songs. For me, listening back to it, after 30 years and with a fresh perspective, it really jumps out at me how much of a star Snoop Dogg is. Snoop Dogg dominates this album. Dr. Dre seemingly wasn't a great rapper, and he got a lot of his raps ghostwritten. Whereas Snoop was absolutely, he was, as to use the parlance of the genre, the OG. He walked the walk. You can tell that by listening to him.
Yeah.
That what he brings to this record is absolute authenticity, whereas Dre's probably, by this point, he's a successful producer, but he's bringing everything together and stirring the pot. But it's really Snoop Dogg who runs the show here, and that's got a cast of just about anybody who was involved in West Coast rap at the time. Nate Dogg, Warren G, the Dog Pound, and
they're great names, aren't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Martin said it, two dogs in a cage, you know.
Yeah.
It's you know, it's not my kind of thing, but I get why people dug it, you know. There's the things that I like most about it, aside from Snoop Dogg, were the samples. The samples were, you know, really fucking good.
Clever, yeah.
Really, the kind of samples, they sampled the kind of things that I like to listen to, you know, the blaxploitation soundtracks and the old classic like Donny Hathaway and Lou Donaldson bits and the Mac and things like that. I love their use of those samples. Is it enough to keep me interested for an hour? Probably not. But it is inventive, and you know, it makes for a more interesting sonic melange than most albums of its type. It's probably sold, you know, it's for every motherfuck. It's probably $1 for every motherfuck. You know, it's
triple platinum in its first 5 years and still selling. I think. Just did the Super Bowl. Just did the Super Bowl show. Did the Super Bowl halftime show a couple of years ago there with Eminem and Kendrick Lamar and all the other guys that came out of that world. And,
and it's a big genre. It just doesn't really resonate with me as much as it probably does with someone from a different background. It just doesn't really work for me personally.
63 minutes long. 24% Twitter. Twitter's always struggled with the rap hip hop stuff, which is fair enough. Probably some of our audience, I guess, but you know, we do get a few comments from guys from America and stuff that are big fans of it, which I guess gives you that sort of balance between the two. He had one or two issues as well. He's had some assault stuff as an individual, and he's ended up latterly putting a lot of kind of altruistic stuff back in. He's donated, you know, like hundreds of millions of dollars to new schools and stuff like that in his neighborhood, and so there's things going on there. I guess as everyone gets older, I guess you reflect a bit, and you know, that attitude thing that he had, he maybe doesn't have so much now, I guess, which makes sense. Not much more to add really. As I say, we've voted a couple of hip hop rap on, but I think we've sort of voted the majority of them out. So we're obviously going to have a vote on this one. I just wanted to comment. So when we got the votes in from previous guests, when Graham Skinner came back, Graham had voted it as a yes, and I just double checked that with him, and he said yes. He says, I have that album, and while I'm more of a rock pop soul guy, that album is hugely influential in the hip hop sphere, which I thought was quite interesting.
Absolutely get it,
yeah, absolutely. So so Graham was in. The other guys were no. David and Chris and Dixon were no's on that one, and Twitter was a no. So, John, you led us off, mate. I think I might know where this is going.
Yeah, it'll be a no for me. I'd much prefer to listen to Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style over this any day of the week.
It's interesting. Martin?
I would. There's so many albums in the genre that I would much rather listen to, like Cypress Hill, Black Sunday, the first two Missy Elliott albums, NWA's first album. Not this one, not for me.
Okay, George.
As you know, as the herald of Snoop Dogg's talent, I think it's got a place, but of its kind, it's probably right up there. But for me, I can't put it in because I wouldn't go back and listen to it again.
Okay. I would put it in, but I think you're right. If you took Snoop Dogg off it, I probably wouldn't. So whether I'm then just more a fan of Snoop Dogg, I don't know. But I really liked it. I thought it's quite weird to say. I thought it was quite easy to listen to. Which maybe it's not meant to be. I don't know, but I quite enjoyed it. So.
Maybe it depends on your mood.
Well, listen, I've had nights out in Port Glasgow, so you know a lot of this makes sense to me. That survival instinct and all that, right?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a night out in Gurrick the other week there.
That's what I heard. You heard you dissed me. Yeah.
Well, no, you. Yeah, I did actually. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's finish on a upbeat. So number 36 tonight is Michael Jackson, Off the Wall. So from Rolling Stone, quote, the ballads were what made Off the Wall a Michael Jackson album. Quote, Jackson remembered of his big solo splash, which spun off 4 top 10 hits and eclipsed the success of the Jackson 5. Well, I'd done ballads with my brothers, but they had never been too enthusiastic about them and did them more as a concession to me than anything else. At the end of She's Out of My Life, you can hear Jackson actually break down and cry in the studio. But the unstoppable dance tracks on and off the wall remain classic examples of Jackson as a one-man disco inferno. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Rock With You, and Burn This Disco Out still get the party started today. So that's Michael Jackson, number 36, Off the Wall, released on the 10th of August, 1979. Last one tonight. George, tell me about your Michael Jackson affiliation.
Yeah, listen, full disclosure here, I might have been a fan of the jam and, 60s beat music, but I loved soul and disco, and I still do.
Yeah.
And, when Michael and the Jacksons moved from Motown to Philly International, they were doing this Gamble and Huff sound, Show You the Way to Go and stuff, and I loved all that. So it was clear that it was after, a more adult, sophisticated sound than a lot of the low-end disco that was around at the time. And as Diana Ross was moving towards working with Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, Michael hooked up with Quincy Jones after filming The Wiz, I think it was.
It was, yeah.
The Wiz.
It was.
It was. Great film as well, of course.
Okay. But this feels like his first proper solo album. I know he'd made a few solo albums before, but this felt like his first proper solo album. And the crew that was assembled to help him make it is incredible. You get 3 songs by Michael himself. You've got 3 from a big skinny boy for Cleethorpes called Rod Temperton, who's one of the he's like one of the great writers of his genre. As well as contributions by people like Stevie Wonder, Paul McCartney, George Duke, Larry Carlton, the brothers Johnson. It's a magnificent pop record, an absolutely magnificent pop record. It's confidently produced. The ending's probably a wee bit slick for, many contemporary listeners, but, I still love it as much as I love Setting Suns and Sandinista. And I listening back to today, I was like, I'm instantly transformed back to 1979, and I can hear why George Michael was so influenced by this album. There's so much early Wham and early George Michael in this. I know Thriller sold more, but this for me is easily its equal.
It's interesting. We'll get on to Thriller, no doubt, at some point. So this was his 5th studio solo album, but his first post-Motown. And you can see and hear the difference between what they would have knocked out in the factory versus this kind of unique sound that he did with Quincy Jones and that whole disco thing that.
But you also had people like, string arrangers like Ben Wright and Johnny Mandel bringing in string arrangements. So everybody that was on the album was absolutely top notch. Yeah. So the outcome was it was a surefire hit. And
it came off the back of the whole Saturday Night Fever thing, which had made sort of disco worldwide, I guess, in 77, 78. So it's quite interesting. Martin,
great pop music.
Yeah, it's amazing pop music. You're absolutely on the money, George. Martin.
It's just not my kind of thing. I'm not really, although weirdly enough.
So quantify that, the disco or funk or soul or Jackson's or what?
High level produced disco music, really.
So the slickness of it and that whole.
Yeah. I much prefer 60s soul, even 70s, early 70s. Soul music. Though one of the strange things is that, like, Burn This Disco Out, the last track on the album, the percussion and it was just really reminding me of the Talking Heads album.
Okay.
Remaining Light. Like a lot of the percussive effects that are happening in this album are also on the Talking Heads album, but it's just it doesn't break any ground for me. I love actually Don't Stop. I think that's a really great pop song. a pop record, and it also has that weird, again, there's a sort of there's a feeling that's shared with Remaining Light there. I can't quite put my finger on it. It's that sort of, I think I mentioned the choral stuff that Eno and David Byrne were doing on Remaining Light, and that always reminds me of late 60s things like The Fifth Dimension doing The Age of Aquarius. There was something kind of spooky about that kind of vocal
ethereal.
Yeah, it was a bit spooky. It wasn't scary even. Like, I don't know, not creepy quite, but kind of
otherworldly.
Yeah. And the string arrangements which have been mentioned on Don't Stop are just amazing. But as an album, I'm sorry to say, I wouldn't put it back on again.
It was his first solo #1, Don't Stop, and then the album just went mega after that, and it was on the charts.
I think that's a fantastic
months.
That's a fantastic track.
So is it an album of sort of hit singles that become an album, if that makes sense? Or like Thriller, I guess we'll get onto Thriller, but of course that had so many big hit singles that it was almost kind of hard to feel it as an album because they all kind of knocked themselves out. So if you listen to the 3 or 4 hit singles on it, Martin, would you then think, yeah, I love that.
I didn't love it. I didn't love Rock With You. Don't like
all right,
that.
okay.
And I didn't like the ballad single, which was a hit single. My wife loved Snoop Dogg, and she said my wife's 10 years younger than me, and she was kind of grown up round about the time that Dr. Dre album hit. She was like at college at the time the Dr. Dre album happened. She said she was out there dancing in these clubs where she was the only white female, and she was going, "What, you don't like this album?" She just couldn't understand it. And then I said I didn't like this one, and she was like, "You don't rock with me." I'm like, "No, don't." She's a big indie fan and indie music fan. She likes some pretty bizarre stuff, but this is meat and potatoes for culturally, in America. It's just like the sound of America in a way.
Okay.
I'm more of a European. That's the way I look at it.
That's fine. That's why you're on, mate, to have your views on it. John?
Yeah, I'm not a huge Michael Jackson fan, and that's probably not a great starting point. I do think there are some real highlights on it. Don't Stop. Yeah, it's just a fantastic pop song, isn't it? Getting the Floor, just funky, ridiculous, absolutely brilliant. Loved that. And then She's Out of My Life. I think that's the ballad one. Maybe you're talking about, Martin. I absolutely love that song. I think his voice is really there's a bit of a piano going on in the background, but his voice is really the star of the show. It really soars, and that's the main bit for me. So I did like it, but it's just that type of album. It just doesn't move me. I came away feeling just a bit, right, fine, let's play it again, see if you change your mind. And you pick me bits out of it, but it's not the type of music that will get me wanting to play it again, sadly. I do think there are probably better Michael Jackson albums out there that may have came later. Let's say I would expect there to be.
Well, there's definitely one more to come on the list.
One, maybe.
Yeah, only one. And this was definitely, it's hard to call it breakthrough because obviously he'd been going for so long, but this was his breakthrough. This, as a solo artist, this made him huge. And it was a different sound, whatever you say about the disco strings arrangement and the slickness, that Quincy Jones sound at the time was fairly unique. So I wonder whether you're looking back on it now thinking, wow, it sounds a bit, kind of a bit sheeny and what have you. But this is before the 80s. A lot of stuff in the 80s came out that had that kind of sheen on it and didn't really do that in the late 70s. So probably was a little bit kind of cutting edge, but it was overproduced. You can definitely hear that in it as well. I find it quite interesting. I'm not a big Michael Jackson fan at all, but I don't think it has to move me. It just sounds great. It's maybe more a background. No, background's not right, but I would put it on a Saturday night if we had some friends round and stuff. And
well,
Make sure it's not a night you're inviting me then.
Funny,
get the White Sox on. Yeah.
Back in the early 80s, I'd have been about maybe 16 or 17, and I was running at a friend's place, and it was a old-fashioned record session kind of thing. So we were all about 16 or 17 or something at the time. So I listened to our, the music that we were all into at the time.
Mm.
And it would all be, things that were much cooler than Michael Jackson. Someone put the Michael Jackson Off the Wall album on, and it was one of those, take that off, take it off, and it started, and they're going, okay, just leave that one on, leave it on. But by the time they got to She's Out of My Life, all the girls were in tears. They were genuinely in tears, and I was like, wait a fucking minute here. I'm keeping this in mind. This is a real. It carried up. It was the first time I realised the song carried so much emotion and it resonated with people was during that wee party. And then all of a sudden I was like, no, I'm not crying. Let's get
get the jam on. Yeah.
Flashback on or whatever on it was. But and I've never forgotten that. It was Off the Wall that did it in that particular song. So
And I think, of course, it became huge, and he won Grammys for sort of various things. Interestingly, he didn't win a Grammy for Best Album, which really peeved him at the time. And that was one of the things that he said drove him to make Thriller, where he wanted to, in his head, to have 8 or 9 perfect pop songs that, were a slam dunk for the Grammy, which obviously he did get at that point. 13 number ones after that. Biggest selling album in 1980 in America, 20 million. I mean, the story's amazing. Looking back on it now, I think before we have a vote on it, I think the thing that maybe I lose track of is that, the Jackson's story and how all that came about, because this is towards the end, obviously, of the family sort of musical career, and he was carrying them really, at this point, or had been carrying them for a while, and his upbringing was pretty poor, I think there's all stories about his dad and stuff.
Abusive,
so, yeah. So, albeit he then subsequently turned into a individual of, I guess, some question. But you can maybe see why these guys have got some demons in there, which isn't good. I've got one other really nice tidbit for you, but I'll save that to the vote because it's a nice way to finish, I think. So 70% Twitter, yes for this one, which was good, 42 minutes, which feels pretty good for an album. Any other bits on it before we have a vote on it? John, are we missing anything on this one?
Nope.
No. What about what's our view on White Sox? Are we White Sox fans?
Only
I think his looking album covers fantastic.
You like a White Sox, John, don't you?
Of course you do, yeah.
Yeah. With
Get the tasseled loafers on,
Get the loafers on, yeah. I used to have it. During the Style Council phase, I was a bit of a White Sox man. Yeah, but that's a while ago now. Martin, are you prone to knock out some White Sox in the Filthy Tongue gigs? Or?
White Sox, I am completely dressed in black and always will be. Quite like an occasional white fish skeleton.
Right, well done. Well done. Okay, cool. Let's vote on this one. So George, you kicked us on this one.
I loved listening back to it, and I will go back to it again. It's 100% in for me.
Cool. Martin.
If it goes along the lines of will I go away and listen to it again, I'll never listen to it again. So I suppose from that perspective, then it's a no from me. But I've got to say, I think Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone I would go back and listen to that over. Some Jackson 5 things I would definitely go and listen to again, but
okay.
It's just not for me.
No bother, mate. Thank you. John?
Sadly, no. I don't think it's one of the top 100 albums of all time, no.
Even with the White Sox, right?
Even with the White Sox.
Okay. I'm a yes, and I genuinely am not a big Michael Jackson fan. Like Prince and guys like that are way ahead of him for me. But I think it's a great album. So I'm a yes on that one. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, we're in. Yep, 6 yeses and 2 no's. So gives us a carry on that. So the last one to finish is a yes. And my last bit of trivia which I genuinely, I read it and smiled because I could just imagine it happen. So in the early 80s, do you know when he started to do some of these recordings with other artists, like duets with McCartney and stuff like that? So they tried to record some songs with Freddie Mercury. So you can just, I'm already picturing this, you know, they're in the studio together and doing what they do. So they've had a couple of days of doing it and it's doing okay, but they haven't quite kind of nailed it, but they have another day to try it. But in the third or fourth day of recording, Michael Jackson turns up with his llama to the studio. And Mercury says, "Red line, I am out of here." Right, so the
White Sox, it wasn't
White Sox, and the llama was the llama that redlined it. Yeah. So you may never heard those songs. I don't know what they are.
I would have thought that they couldn't work together because of their physical actions when they danced, because they knocked somebody's eye out with something, Freddie with his mic stand and Michael with his back kicks and all that stuff.
Well, I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but there's no Queen albums on the list at the moment, so I'll leave that one to ponder. So we've got 5 through. So Bowie was a yes, Talking Heads yes, Dylan yes, Dr. Dre no, and Jackson yes. So that's I think that gives us 40, I think, out of 65. Need to double check that, which is cool. Great, brilliant, thank you. So first of all, big thanks to Martin for joining us. We love having guests on, and some great music out there as well, mate. So keep that coming. It's cracking, great album, Filthy Tongues. And also, mate, we do ask our guests to nominate a record that they would like us to consider for the list. And I know you've had some thoughts on this and you've pondered it a little bit. So have you came up with one that you'd like us to go away and have a listen to?
I would have said Your Funeral, My Trial by Nick Cave, which is his third solo album, sorry.
Okay.
But I think I feel some kind of responsibility for kicking Dr. Dre out, and I really think that like Cypress Hill, Black Sunday, I think you would enjoy that album, and people would enjoy that album out there.
Yeah.
Nick Cave's, he's doing all right. He doesn't need the world in him.
So you're going with Cypress Hill, Black Sunday, yeah? Perfect, mate. Yeah, we know that.
I've got that album.
Yeah, we know that album for sure. It's not on the list, I don't think. You're right. So good. Mm-hmm. That's a nice challenge for us to get our chops around that. So we'll add all the guest nominations onto the list at the end, because we're going to have other nominations as well, and we'll mix them all through and we'll do some votes, and no doubt you hear whether it gets on or not. So thank you very much for that, and thanks again for taking part tonight. Really appreciate that. For the next episode, the next 5 we will review are the Beatles, Rubber Soul, Stevie Wonder, Inner Visions, Amy Winehouse, Back to Black, Beyonce, Lemonade, and we've been waiting on this one, Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. And I'm hoping we'll have a guest on for that one as well. So yeah, another really nice bunch of records there to get our head around. Have we missed anything, guys? Are we okay with that?
Nope.
Fine.
Brilliant. As ever, thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated. And until next time, stay safe, everyone. We'll see you soon. Take care now.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Martin.
Bye.
Bye.